Hello, hello. Thank you all for joining and spending a little bit of your time listening to me. I'm Aaron Rasmussen. I am the co-founder of Masterclass and also the founder and CEO of Outlier.org. And I would love to talk to you today about the golden age of design, specifically in education, which we are in right now. So when I think about education, I think of two questions. So the first is, what do we learn? This is a really complicated question, and you'll see why. And it's not something I'm actually going to touch on much in this talk. I've talked about it elsewhere. But the problem with this question is that it begs additional questions. For example, why are we learning? And why are we learning asks us, why are we here? Is it to get a good job, status? Is it to further science, intrinsic value, innovation, art? Ultimately, this begs the fundamental question of life. Why are we here? What is life for? That's why designing a curriculum or a program can be incredibly difficult, because I think there's a lot of different ideas about what the purpose of education is, purpose of a degree, purpose of life. So thank goodness I'll be able to skip that in this. So we'll go on to the second one, which is, how do we learn it, right? What do we learn? How do we learn it? And I think there is an idea of where this all heads. How do we learn as quickly as possible? Thank you to The Matrix, 1999, where Neo says to Trinity, can you fly that thing? And she says, not yet. Then she says to Tank, I need a pilot program for a B-21-2 helicopter. So he goes on Yahoo, because it's 1999, and he looks it up. And this is what the search results page back then looked like. And he downloads it into her brain, and she goes, let's go. And then they walk super coolly to the helicopter. So this is a long ways off, but it was certainly an ideal back then. In fact, back then, you probably couldn't find much of anything on the B-212 helicopter, which turns out to actually be a real thing. So 23 years later, aka last week, I searched for it, and you know what? You can literally find how to start a Bell 212 on YouTube. That's pretty amazing. We're headed in the direction of that dream. Now, it's a lot slower, right? It's like, do you know how to fly this thing? And Trinity's like, not yet. And she just starts Googling. And she's like, sorry, ad for Geico. And then eventually she can fly this helicopter, right? Probably takes 7 or 8 months. However, we're at the very beginning of this. And you see this in sort of drips and drabs. And one thing that's very important to remember is that access to information is not the same as education, right? Education is the process of receiving or giving systematic instruction. So I also found this thing. This is from 1972, I think. It's just the manual to a Bell helicopter. It'd be pretty difficult to learn the same thing just through this, but it's possible. The difference is the instructor. And at Outlier, and I guess I should explain, Outlier does 4-credit courses online. We try to do the best job we possibly can. People earn credits for them. It's asynchronous, cohort-based, et cetera. So when we think about this, we like to remind ourselves that the scarcest and most valuable thing in education is one-on-one time with a teacher. And that's because we as humans are good at simulating other minds. In fact, Robert Sapolsky does this talk about what is it that we can do that chimpanzees can't do? And one of the things is theory of mind of mind. I can make some guesses about what you think somebody else knows. It's a couple steps off, but it's very important for instruction. So Benjamin Bloom, back in the 60s, found that there was a 2 sigma increase in a student's performance if they got one-on-one tutoring. So what does that mean? 90% of students in a class can pass a class if they have one-on-one tutoring. That is a fantastic thing. It's also extremely expensive and very hard to do. So as we think about education design, something to keep in the back of our minds is, this is a great resource. How do we maximize it? How do we take the difficult things off of instructors' plates that might be more busy work, and instead allow them to spend more time in one-on-one instruction, discussion groups, facilitating conversations, these things that human beings are particularly good at? Which brings us to an interesting thing that's happening generationally. So when we think of the classic style of education, right? You go to college, there's a person on the stage, they talk to you, there are textbooks, That worked really well. We literally used that system to put a person on the moon. That's impressive. Now, it doesn't mean we can't improve, but it's a great starting point. And what I found, I like to lecture every kind of semester at USC for the past maybe 5 years, is that the sentiments of the students have changed. And I've written a little bit about this before, but when it comes to design, the very relationship with the next generation and products or objects or education has changed. For example, when I was a kid growing up in the 90s, if you knew how to program a VCR, that was awesome. It was like, wow, my kid's so smart. He can program a VCR. And I'm like, yep, I recorded just Friends and nothing else. Although really sometimes record like 8 hours after it. I still don't know why that happened. So kids today, students today, this next generation, when they look at a service like, let's say, HBO Max, and you click on the episode that you thought you were watching, but it turned out you fell asleep and you need to go to a different episode. I don't know if ever anybody's run into this. It can be pretty hard to find how you get back to another episode. When I ask students about this, they say that's because their design is dumb. They weren't smart, which seems pretty harsh. However, the secondary thing, which I like, is they're not just critics. They're not just telling you what's wrong. They're editors. They're good at telling you what is wrong with a product. That includes education. Now, huge caveat here. Students are not always right when it comes to what will make them learn the best, right? For example, the thing that's wrong with my test is you didn't give me all the answers. And that's not actually going to help students learn that much. So at Outlier, for example, we make it very clear when we're doing something that is difficult because it helps you learn. However, they will tell you a lot that's incredibly useful, that helps us further education overall. Now, this is a very good thing for education designers because a lot of the work that we ordinarily sort of have to do and innovate and come up with these new ideas, you can just ask a student and they'll just tell you, you know, it'd be really helpful if we had a couple different explanations of this. That's how we ended up filming a calculus course 3 times so students can choose whichever instructor they want to learn from. Students simply asked for that. I focus grouped with college students, focus grouped with high school students. They all said the same thing. We go to YouTube to learn. We record the professor. If we don't understand something, we go to YouTube. Now, it's very hard once innovation has gone forward to move backwards. Can you imagine launching like a VCR today and being like, you get to watch your favorite shows, just read this 200-page manual and use this remote? That would be hard. Same thing with SD going to HD, going to 4K. It's hard to go back and watch an SD video. No value judgment there. I'm just saying it's difficult. And it means that we have to keep going forward once there are new expectations set. For example, I find it intolerable to listen to certain podcasts at 1x speed. It's just excruciating. Who knows if that's a good thing or a bad thing? But I do know that now that I have the ability to listen at multiple x speed, that's what I want. In fact, studies have said that if you listen to something at 2x speed twice versus once at 1x, you'll actually retain more. That's pretty cool. Why not retain more? Why not retain more and synthesize? The most embarrassing version of this is I walked to the hotel room upstairs with all my stuff last night, and I said, Alexa, lights. And nothing happened. And fortunately, it's all dark, so like I couldn't even see my own shame in the mirror, you know? So then I had to figure out how a light switch works. But this is what we're seeing in education, is that there are new expectations because instruction is coming from everywhere now. So briefly, Masterclass, when we launched Masterclass, keep in mind that there were no high-end cinema-level courses being filmed. Not that we could find, at least. This is actually me interviewing Aaron Sorkin. Tons of fun. Look at all this crazy equipment. It's extremely expensive. There were very good reasons for people to not do this. But now, people have an expectation that online education can be beautiful. Same thing with Outlier. We looked around, and I was confused because we didn't have a version that was super gorgeous and beautifully produced like that. Now, we had some very good online classes, by the way. I benefited personally from MIT OpenCourseware back in the early 2000s, you know, being in rural Oregon on my little 14.4 dial-up trying to like see these classes. It was amazing. It was amazing to have access to that information, to that teaching. But we can't really put the genie back in the bottle. I want to speak, I'm not going to go into the details about the rest of what we do at Outlier. I've spoken about that elsewhere as far as pushing kind of education, retention and synthesis. We'll be talking about other stuff. But I did want to say something about beauty, because obviously those two companies, we have a very glossy look. And I've thought a lot about why does it seem that beauty retains engagement? And it's because we're social animals, right? So if you stand on the street, let's say you're walking down the street in New York and you see everybody staring at something. What are you going to do, not look at the thing? Of course you look at the thing, right? We're social. It's good to look at the thing because what if that is a tiger? What if it is a cool food source? Free cake? I have no idea. We're programmed to look at what other people look at. And beauty is a way of crystallizing attention. It's saying somebody focused on this. Somebody gave attention to this. And it's one of the many tricks you use to get a student through a course that might not be the most fascinating thing for them. It might be relatively difficult for them. I've spent a lot of time kind of defending beauty to various parties and justifying why we put so much effort into it. Because when I think of the future of education design, we may actually be talking about the future of motivation design. A highly motivated enough person can just make it through a textbook, right? Learning calculus is free. Just go to the library, check out a textbook, sit in a dark room. Well, I guess you could have a little light. For 2 months, you come out the other side, you know calculus. That's incredibly difficult to do. It's very hard to ask somebody to do. So we frequently look at fitness, right? I don't like going to the gym, but if I have a friend that'll go to the gym with me, I'm happy to. Well, still hate going to the gym. It's just you have somebody to hate it with. And you still get the same results, which is fantastic. So enter the pandemic. I think of this as the tragic equalizer, both in just the tragedy of the pandemic, but also in the way it switched us to an online solution. The amazing thing here is that all the accoutrements of college were stripped away instantly. And suddenly, everyone was essentially using the same tools. Few notable exceptions with colleges and universities that were ahead of the game with that, but most people are using Zoom, they're using Canvas or Blackboard, they're using Google Docs. So the big differentiator then is the instructor, not the pomp and circumstance of going into a beautiful room, which is helpful, by the way. It's important not to scoff at such things. You sit somebody in a really beautiful room and you stand somebody up on stage, you're more likely to pay attention to them. And that might be that little extra dose of motivation you need to get somebody through a course. But in the case of the pandemic, we had to switch to Zoom and online in like a week. This is hard. This is not an experiment in online education, or in doing online education the best way. It's an experiment in doing it the fastest way, which is not necessarily the most effective way. I have to admit, I've spent years of my life designing online education. I work with incredibly talented teams. We have lots of funding, lots of time, the best instructors in the world, and it is still incredibly hard. After spending months and months and months, we still make mistakes. So doing it in a week is very difficult, and I certainly applaud the teachers and professors and instructors who all did that. So Zoom can be great. It can actually be a really fantastic way to deliver a course. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the big thing that this has brought is an understanding that online education works. Before the pandemic happened, it's funny, I get this frequently. Oh, you're thinking of doing this online education company. Does online education really work? It sounds like a silly question, but I think it's a fair question. I say question everything. But now we know, yes, it absolutely does. People are able to learn over it. We've also learned that there are some aspects of it we really don't like, and some aspects we do like. We've learned that it's removed some barriers, but also created others. So when we think about the instructor being the big differentiator at this point, what does the instructor of the future look like? So it could look like R1 institutions, liberal arts schools, community colleges, PhD students. We had one that was actually a World Jeopardy champion, pretty interesting, really excellent instructor. But when we divorce these appointments from the instruction, we end up with some other really interesting sources. For example, you see students learning on TikTok. You see students, of course, learning on YouTube, Twitch, Discord. Khan Academy just deserves a mention because it really is a phenomenal tutoring service. I mean, this is, was clearly life-changing for many students. I would have loved to have it. When I was going through, elementary school, middle school, high school, this is something that is the future of education, right? We now have an instructor who's not affiliated with the institution, but is helping students through their work that gets them to that degree. The other thing to think about is the fact that some people are simply naturally gifted teachers. So we will see in the future a 15-year-old that turns out to be amazing at explaining calculus. They're probably already out there, I'm just on the wrong channels. But if you could imagine, that could be the most effective thing. And that's what we'll be looking at is, what is the most effective instructor? You'll also find these instructors when we were developing calculus. I met this instructor in his 80s. He'd taught for 50 years, he'd retired, and he was this wealth of extraordinary knowledge, which I really wished we could have communicated years before. And we'll find these people, and we'll bring them out there. I'm talking about we as a community of educators. There's going to be a whole host of approaches. So the instructor of the future is the most effective for this student. And by that I mean, there's going to be a lot of different choices for students. In fact, when I was doing focus groups, trying to figure out what do students want, I ran into something twice, which is not a lot, but it's something that I should pay attention to, which is a dyslexic student, another dyslexic student, said the best teacher I ever had dyslexia. Totally makes sense, right? That this instructor figured out the pathway that could make this thing work. Wouldn't it be incredible if we had a whole curriculum taught by somebody with dyslexia that had figured out how to get that information into that style of brain, right? Or another style of brain. This is the future that we can expect in the golden age. And there's no going back, right? The first one of these comes out, we're going to continue to use it. So what's the future of instruction look like? Well, same story. An incredibly diverse approach, both through methods and sources. I hope in-person instruction continues. I think it's fantastic. For whatever reason, it works really well. Again, put a person on the moon. But we will also see people drawing from corporate training. I happen to love corporate training methods because there's no tradition whatsoever. It's, do these students pass this test? So whatever works, works. And you find these really creative solutions. The other thing we'll see is video games. You'll notice I had Riot Games on there before. There's a huge amount of instruction in video games. People are highly motivated to learn these very complex systems. And we're starting to see pretty impressive design in them. For example, there's a shot of Apex Legends. There's the original group of Legends. Don't need to know a ton about it, except it's a battle royale, so everybody jumps into the same thing. And the big innovation, and it may have been somewhere else before, but this is the first place I saw it, is you can ping things, right? You can kind of notify people of various things in the environment, and it will describe them in that person's native language. How cool is this? You can have cross-language interactions that are relatively complex. So you can go on a hunt with this team, and you can say, let's go over there. No, we should go over there. There's an enemy here. I found a submachine gun for you there. Whatever, there's a power up here. All in the native language of the other person. And you can have these cross-language relationships, and that's amazing. This is a solution from video games. A bunch of people have now picked it up. It's now in Warzone and Valorant, all sorts of things. The other thing to think of is the peer-based learning that we see in video games. There aren't instructors in these video games. You might have a virtual one, an AI one. But they figured out how to set these things up so you have a social structure which promotes peer-based learning. You go into Valorant, you're going to find out really quickly whether you're doing something wrong. It might be a little harsh, but occasionally you find some people, or I shouldn't say occasionally, frequently you find people that are actually quite nice because they want you to do well. This is where a lot of excellent education design is happening. The other part of great design is new design is partly just adopting existing innovations. We've had great innovations throughout the years, and a lot of it hasn't been adopted. You see the Benjamin Bloom stuff. Alan Kay in 1968 was carrying around a Dynabook, which is basically an iPad. Like, think about that. We could just look back to 1968, and you could see this person wanted to make a thing, but we weren't able to do it as a society or had the traditions to adopt it. In fact, in the music industry, today, only about 5% of streams are new music. All the rest is old music, right? Because you're competing now with all of the greatest pieces of music ever made. I remember Hans Zimmer talked about this when it came to film scoring. People would like temp Chopin Nocturne No. 2 into a movie. And they would say something like, oh yeah, just try to write something like that. Just try to write something like Chopin. Thank you. Thank you. That's an easy task. However, in education, this starts today. We will be the generation who makes these historical educational modules that will teach people throughout the future. Now, obviously, some of these still exist. I Learned Recorder from the Von Trapp family book. This thing's got to be like, I don't know, 80 years old. If anybody's seen the Feynman entropy lecture, I don't have a better version of that. That's just the greatest explanation. I love it. We'll be making these things. My recommended reading is Stephen Koslin's book on active learning online. This is just a great overview of what's already out there, but also how to apply it to frequently Zoom lectures, but all sorts of online education. Granted, the future of education isn't just online. There's plenty of different approaches. But this I found is very helpful. Before this book, I really loved Make It Stick. Ultimately, this will benefit instructors and benefit students. For example, for instructors, I know a professor who, unfortunately, due to an illness, cannot go into the classroom anymore. But she is able to continue teaching because we have these new methodologies, because she can teach online. The students have an amazing experience with a great instructor, and she gets to continue doing the things she loves. Now with students, as we become more efficient and more efficacious in what we do, they'll spend less money, right? This will be less expensive. They'll spend either less time learning the same things or the same time learning more. If I had to make a prediction on that, I think it's going to be the same time learning more just because of our forgetting curve and kind of the way our brains work. You just need a certain amount of time. We'll be able to start approaching things from a post-scarcity standpoint. We're no longer constrained by the supply on education if we can get these designs right. It becomes a place of abundance instead of scarcity. And it makes us ask ourselves, how do we make the best education available to everyone? Now, these are not without their dangers. This is the lunar lander on the moon. I just liked it. So we have a few dangers with this, which is we won't capture what works and what doesn't. Already a lot of that's happened. Sometimes it's because we don't have the wherewithal, right? We're overwhelmed by trying to bring our classes online. Other times we don't have the humility to think that maybe we aren't the best. We've literally reshot units of our courses because they weren't good enough. We didn't get them right. And it's very clear when you don't get something right. I think there's a danger we'll cling to the old models and fail to innovate, fail to accept these innovations. But there's a similar danger that we will throw out the baby with the bathwater. Because again, the old models got us onto the moon. So when we think about liberal arts, that's a fantastic thing. When we think about the in-person experience of a life-changing conversation, that's a fantastic thing. So one of the dangers is thinking that we can't replicate all of those online. Let's try and let's fail, right? And let's try again. Figure out what's possible to distribute, to make accessible, whether it's remote, asynchronous, AI, like in a video game. Okay, so the future of great design in education is it's going to be efficacy. That is going to be the bar by which we measure everything. When unmired in tradition, we'll see a great diversity of instructors, a great diversity of approaches, some of which will fail spectacularly. And they should. I always think about this when I'm skiing. If I'm not falling, I'm not really growing as a skier, right? I'm kind of playing it safe. There's going to be more options for everyone. It will be better for everyone. Again, cheaper, more effective, more opportunity to learn, again, and this comes right back to that first question of what should we learn? Because frequently, you will decide what you should learn based on how you can learn it. Can you afford it? Can you go to that place? So what a tragedy it is for someone to miss out on what they want to learn because the how wasn't available. So it's our duty as educators to innovate, to become the best at the how, so people can choose what they want to learn. So people in the room today, and outside this room, and everywhere, right? So streamers on TikTok and YouTube and Twitch, they'll be the ones coming up with the new designs, the new interactions. So go, try the wild things, and enjoy the golden age. Thank you.